Good day, all, and welcome to Critical Faculty. You're with Hani Salim. Today, we're revisiting Christianity. It's been a while since we've addressed Christianity. It's been about Islam for the last few months, but I've got just the right guest to take us through the Christian faith and whether it is as benign as it seems to be. Please join me in welcoming Seth Andrews. Hello, Seth. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. I just wanted to involve you in a situation. As you know, probably in previous conversations, I've have Islam in my father's side of the family, and recently on a lot of Clubhouse and TikTok chats, there is a movement where Christian priests and sort of clergies are trying to move on to the Muslim faith, with lots of younger generation who are fed up with the violence, fed up with the rigid face of Islam, and trying to attract new recruits, if you wish. So today, I just want to sort of dissect Christianity and want to see whether it's as benign and as meek as it's sort of playing out to be.
Sure, absolutely.
Uh, Sandwiched between two faiths, almost three separate gods. Once you're sort of having a closer look, there are three different gods with three different characteristics. But the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, compared to his son or himself, um, how do you reconcile that difference in attitude and direction?
Well, it's not just the Old and New Testament, and it's not just by translation or culture, but if you read the Bible, even book by book, then the Gospels in the New Testament, they depict four different Jesuses. He was born differently, he lived differently, he spoke differently, he died differently. He had all these different attributes and characteristics. And it's very much a reflection, I think, of what the authors of Scripture, whoever they were, wanted to portray. I think their gods were agenda driven. They were patriarchal. They were culturally driven. I think many of them were about control. But I think as human beings have become more civilized, as we have evolved, so many of us have realized that we can't reconcile the God of genocide, the God of slavery, the God of human sacrifice, the God of all of these other superstitions. We just can't jive with that. It doesn't work. And so Christianity and other religions like Islam then try to evolve to become culturally relevant instead of theologically relevant. So in Christianity, Catholicism, etc., you see among many the embrace finally an embrace of evolutionary science. You have the narrative that Jesus would never judge anybody and he loves all, and that Christ never spoke out against gay people, and Jesus would never silence women, or the biblical God was never a misogynist. And people tend to rewrite gods, I think, and refashion them in their own image to represent their values. So if you look at it from that vantage, you'll find millions of shades of Yahweh and Jesus among Christians worldwide.
It is very true. It looks like the culture dictates the narrative because the God of Judaism is very similar to the God of Islam, and because they have very similar backgrounds, shepherds, peasants, very culturally poor societies with very little to as in terms of resources. But when you go to the Greco-Roman sort of culture and the tragedy and the drama of that particular culture, there is no wonder Jesus has been manufactured in a culture that's so befitting.
And I think there is also the myth that Yahweh was the bad cop and Jesus was the good cop, because Jesus was a tremendously, if as a mythological God man, Jesus remains a problematic figure. Even in the pages of scripture, comparing this woman to a dog, and he was
Mm.
said some racist stuff and gave really bad advice. And he is the same part of a triune deity that manufactured hell and implements the torture chamber of Hades and blah, blah, blah. My friend Dr. David Madison has written a book called 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Taught. It's a great book. I narrated the audiobook. I was glad to be involved, but he's also got a website that lists hundreds of things that Jesus said that, they were problematic and often contradictory, many times immoral. And so when people talk about Jesus in that misty-eyed, wistful way, I think, well, they've got this idea of Jesus that they've baked onto their heart, but the biblical, the scriptural Christ is much more problematic.
Yeah, the only way to sort of get around is like some sort of symbolism, like cursing the fig tree for no fault of its own. Things like that. The only way to get around is saying, well, this is not really what it is. It's the fig tree represents something else. And how do you find that sort of new age interpretation of trying to impose symbolism to get around troublesome issues?
Well, I think eh, it's like when you speak to a believer about something that to them makes sense, and they say, well, that's literal, that happened. And then if you present them with something that makes no sense, they say, well, that's metaphor. And if it was immoral, they say, well, that was for a different time. God was condescending to the culture. He was trying to speak the language of more primitive civilizations. And, I had David Fitzgerald, who is a historical researcher and author, said that if you want proof of evolution, just look at Christianity because it has evolved so many variations, so many defense mechanisms against criticism. If it looks right, it happened. If it looks wacky or stupid, well, it's metaphor, or his ways are not our ways. Who has known the mind of God? God uses the confusing things to shame the wise, the foolish things, rather, to shame the wise. And then, if it's atrocious, well, those were Old Testament times and God had to use a heavy hand. There's all these excuses. They have a series of silly putty explanations, no matter what you come at them with. And I think this is often by design. You are talking to someone who holds an identity belief. And so their first thought is not to be right. They want to be proven right. And there is a difference.
What do you think of the narrative that the Roman Empire, with all these messiahs sort of coming about and obviously trying to invoke revolution, which is will have sort of political unrest, finding that particular Jesus who fits the narrative of my kingdom of not of this world, and give that to Caesar, and say, oh, well, you know what? We found your Jesus. This is the Messiah, and sort of gone with it because that would put end to all the alleged messiahs around that time.
I don't know. I'm not an expert. I do know that, oh, first of all, I want to put to rest there is an insidious and ridiculous claim. Was it Joseph Atwood who wrote the book Caesar's Messiah? And I think his claim was that the Romans uh, wrote all of the scripture, like all the entire New Testament was written by Caesar or something along those lines. It was just crazy, just a wackadoodle kind of a claim. Do I believe that the Roman civilization weaponized this specific religious model, even if emperors like Constantine or whatever were true believers? I mean, we saw the pagan deities, we saw the pagan temples that were replaced with
Mm.
Christian temples, with Christian traditions. Many of those became hybrids. How do we appeal to the masses, the Roman masses? Well, let's take their pagan deities and let's sort of take those traditions and let's Christianize them. I think fundamental faiths have always been used for control. Sometimes they're sincerely part of a belief network. I think sometimes they give structure. They fill in blanks. Perhaps they alleviate the fear of death. There are a lot of reasons that we emotional evolved humans have gravitated into religious narratives and how they have united entire cultures. And there's probably some of that true with the early Romans as well. But there are certainly hundreds of gears in that machine. So,
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's sort of an exaggeration because it happened over time. It took Constantine and Theodosius later on, almost 300 years after the initial event. One of the things that the Christian preachers, when they get in touch with Muslims who are on the verge of leaving Islam, is portraying Christianity as a religion of love, pure love. There is nothing here to sort of worry about. What do you think of idea? I mean, you can kill people in different ways. You can kill them sort of literally, and finish them like in Judaism and Christianity, and be done with it, or having them carry a guilt for the rest of their lives, and not thinking they're worthy of much until they bow every single day. The vicarious redemption, the fact that we are born sinners. Because of a couple of people made a certain choice at some point. Is that dangerous?
I think, though, that you could go to a moderate Muslim and they will have painted out the more atrocious scriptures and all of the edicts of oppression and conquest. And they would say that, well, the Islamic God is a God of love. And again, that's an example of someone, I think, creating a deity in their own image according to their own value system. But it's not uncommon for the Christian to look at the Muslim and lament those of the false faith and, come over here to the one true God who is represented by the one true book. And over here, it's love and light. And especially in the West, we become very reductive when it comes to Muslims. We think Muslim equals terrorist, how many bombs have you strapped to your chest today, kind of thing. Not being educated enough to realize that the vast majority of people who are oppressed by Islamic theocracies and totalitarian regimes are themselves Muslims, desperate for liberation, desperate for escape. And so I think it's important that we humanize
Hmm.
all people. We look at the humanity within them first, and then that gives context to what they believe and why they believe it. I do think, and I heard this said once, and I agree, that Islam today, at least fundamentalist Islam, is the Christianity of the 11th century, right?
Hmm.
We have seen much more in the way of jihadism, terrorism, the enacting of even mass violence, the idea of martyrdom through extreme violence. I think, we saw this in Christianity during the Crusades, and we've seen it. I mean, if I'd have seen people try to practice their moderates, I don't think the Bible's necessarily true, but Jesus lives in my heart kind of faith. If you'd have tried that a few hundred years ago, you'd have been burned as a heretic, right? And yet we've seen Christianity evolve out of that and mold more into the culture. But in fundy Islamic faiths, I think they have not yet had that revolution. I think they still live in that sort of jihadist mindset. And as we have seen the Industrial Revolution, the advent of technology, we've seen the sophistication of the weapons of terror. I'm not convinced that Islam has the time that Christianity had, the hundreds and hundreds of years to evolve. I'm not convinced we had that luxury with fundy Islam. And for that reason, I do consider, and this is controversial for some, but I do consider Islam to be, at this point, the most dangerous religion on the planet.
Oh, I tend to agree. And you're absolutely right. It's almost like working the Big Bang from the expansion of the universe. It's if you go back even further, you'll find Judaism is kind of watered down. Almost 80% of all Jews now are culturally Jewish. Most of them are atheists or agnostic or not really true believers. It's so watered down, but they kept somehow, and I think rightly so, because don't think I actually kind of hate it when people burn the Quran and read. I mean, these are documents of our history, and they should be well learned and taught, because through them we understand what we used to do, how we evolved, and they're very important documents because we wrote them. So they reflect our fears, our ignorances, our knowledge of the time. But it seems that as time goes by, you attach yourself to the nice things of religions, because not every single thing religions provided is horrible. The architect, the poetry, the songs, the devotion. There's a couple of few nice things that have sort of evolved from religion.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm glad you brought it up. I understand, and I will support the right to burn a holy book, right? It's ink and paper. It's not sacred. You should have a legal right to do it without facing retribution,
Conflict.
threats,
Yeah.
etc. I don't like it. I don't think it's effective. I think it produces the opposite of what we want. Some people see it as a liberation exercise. This no longer controls me. I refuse to be threatened with a book. I reject the mythology, the oppression, the misogyny, the terrorism. I will have no part of this, and I am not afraid to take the sacred Quran and set it aflame. I understand the sentiment behind it. For some, it is a liberation exercise, and I get that. I get it. But I think the collateral damage is that you have then guaranteed failure when interacting with Quran believers. If the goal is to change minds, to rescue people from bad ideas, and to have adult discussion about the claims being made and why they are wrong, I think if you burn the Quran, that is designed to evoke emotion. You're going to fire people up. When they do that, the amygdala activates, the fight, flight, or freeze response kicks in. They are no longer listening. Now, they may not have been listening anyway, but you've just guaranteed failure. I just don't like it. I don't think it's an effective way to approach these bad ideas. Let's open the Quran and let's look at what's in it and let's talk about that because we are the adults in the room. But when you're speaking about like Judaism, we're at roughly half of people who identify as Jews say they don't believe in God or at least have doubts or questions. Half. That's crazy. It's just wild. But many Jews hold on to the cultural aspects, the framework, and I think that's fantastic. I It was Dr. Andy Thompson, who is an author. He's a psychiatrist. He's an expert in how the brain works, and he said, religion has great utility in creating families out of non-kin. So it's a great social glue, as Dr. Robert Sapolsky has said. It brings people together, and you can use music and ritual, clothing, structure. This can be the plumage. This can be the framework for the human experience. Some people have chided me because I think the idea of a non-theistic religion is actually cool. If you've got a religious model that doesn't involve lying to yourself or lying to children or threatening anybody or overtaking the culture, etc., but it's sort of the plumage of your life. It provides the aesthetic, which makes you happy, whether it involves a service or a specific song or the types of clothes or headdress or jewelry or tattoos or anything that you do. Knock yourself out. I
Mhm.
think great. That's part of the color of being you, the color and culture, and many times those of similar interests can then use that to unite. And I think life being better when it's shared, I think we should find points of unification where we can come together and celebrate those things, as long as they aren't based in lies and as long as they are not making us exclusive against our fellow human beings.
I don't want to fall into the fallacy of low expectations here, but do you think something like religion became the glue of societies because the vast majority of people don't want to really think too much. They like to follow instructions. They like clear instructions. They like to make life seamless as much as they can. But for us, or for the erudites or the intellectuals to create something that will glue people together, a secular religion, if you wish, is kind of impossible. It's like herding cats, because the very reason why you're sort of left cults or religions or groups is because you're so unique and so individual, and therefore the collective of the atheists or the agnostics are very difficult to put together in one room. And I think the saying was, if you put 7 atheists in one room, you'll have 8 opinions. Um, what do you think of that angle? Is there a way to sort of unite the atheist societies?
This is messy. You know, yes, religion, was it Christopher Hitchens who said it was our first explanation for all things, and because it was our first, it was our worst, right? In our ignorance, we were looking for answers. We were pattern seekers. And so we saw agency behind everything, whether it was a natural disaster or some odd thing that happened in our life, or we saw a sense of cosmic justice when we didn't see real justice in our lives. We said, fine, on this planet, the bad guy got away with it, but one day he will get his. I think it alleviated the fear of death. So when we lost a child or a parent or a friend, or we worried about our own mortality, these stories of heaven helped to assuage our fear about having a finite life. I mean, there's so many reasons I think that people believed, but I remain convinced most people are not religious for reasons of theology. They are religious for reasons of community. They want to belong. You want to belong. We are tribal. We are communal creatures. And a lot of people, especially those who have escaped a churchy environment, then will pinball way away from that and say, well, I'm not going to join any group. I'm not going to be a part of any service. I'm not going to identify with any label because I left one flock. I'm not a sheep. I refuse to be herded. And so it becomes almost a kind of overcompensation. I understand if you've been harmed by high controlled church cultures that you want to stay clear of that so you don't get harmed again. I understand distrust of community in that way. But I think we miss out whenever we, as atheist, humanist skeptics, decide that anything in a group we're not going to do, anything organized we're not going to be a part of, because I think life is better when it's shared. And we share experiences as communities all the time. You go to a rock concert, you are a group of people with a shared interest, enjoying the moment together. If you get together to help promote a bill or fight a bad bill that's being offered up in Congress, you are joining together as community to try to promote the good and defeat the bad. If you are into cars and you're part of a car club or bowling night or whatever, I mean, people tribe up all the time. And I don't think it's a cheat to us as human beings to be communities. We can do that, but we're aware enough to not fall into an authoritarian model. We don't do it because we want to be led, because we're looking for saviors. And you're right. A lot of people want to be told. They want to shut down and follow lockstep. The idea of having a savior figure, even a human one, gives them a sense of safety and security. And we've seen authoritarianism weaponized against those people. We've seen grifters and cons and control freaks and just insane people who have rallied together, otherwise intelligent people, and made broad claims and said, distrust everyone else, but trust only me. I will save you. That's playing on human psychology and a very human tendency to respond to authority. The good part about being out of that culture, an ex-evangelical, is now I'm better at seeing those people coming. Now, when someone says, trust me and no one else, I can pretty much say I know they're lying. Now, when they say you cannot challenge this because it is sacred, I say, okay, fine. That is now the first thing I'm going to challenge. Thank you very much. It doesn't mean though that I reject the idea of community. It just means that I perceive it much differently.
It seems that tribalism, once a very useful thing in our humble beginnings, you would completely understand you're an individual, you belong to a group of people, and you're safe. You might have to abide by some rules, and there's a bit of an exchange of personal freedom, an exchange of safety and belonging, and it was very very useful at the very beginning. Things like xenophobia, which is the fear of strange people, which was rightly so. Maybe it wasn't a phobia then; it was a logical thing, because if you're met by somebody who's stranger from the outside tribe, they might want to sort of kill you or take your belongings. And we developed that over time. And once what was kind of useful, it became the tool of a very polarized world in different stages. Right now, we live, I think, in a very polarized world. Within the United States right now, there is a rift going on for obvious reasons. Ukraine, Russia, Palestine, Israel. There's so many things going on at the moment where tribalism or belonging to a group is taken to a level where we're not just keeping ourselves safe, but we're attacking the others to make ourselves feel better. How do we ever overcome this?
I don't know. And tribalism has always been a part of human nature. If we look at wars, warring nations, we've seen tribes, towns, cities, factions, religious groups declaring war on each other. We've always been good at othering, at dehumanizing. I interviewed a former Marine, fought in Vietnam, was terribly injured. But he was talking about how one of the ways he was able to deal with killing other human beings was to strip the North Vietnamese of their humanity. So they were no longer men and women who were fighting. They were gooks, they were zips, they were whatever, slang they came up with to remove their humanity, right? I can wax as many gooks as I want, but I will never kill another human being. That's how he said it. And we've always done this to the other. Being in the United States, it's terrifying that people are proud of an accident of birth. They claim we are the greatest nation on the face of the earth. We're number one, America. And it's very much an emotional position. And it's isolationist. Then we don't really care what the rest of the world does because, hey, that's them. And we only care about us. It's our tribe. It's funny. I've asked Americans, I've said, well, by what metric are we number one? Like, what are we number one in? Well, we're free. We got freedom. And we go, so does Canada. So does New Zealand. So does the UK. Well, what are you talking about? And whenever I go down the list, and I wrote about this in my book, Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian, if you look at the metrics, whether it's the quality of our health care, lifespan, the cost of living, violent crime, domestic abuse, being involved in wars, I know so many different things. We are way down the list when it comes to whether or not we're not close to number one. The only thing we're number one in is military spending and national pride, which means that we are number one at saying we are number one. And I used to have that mindset when I was a devout believer. We were one nation under God. God ordained us to lead the world. It was a very myopic and superior position. Coming out of the faith, I have much more seen us as citizens of the world. I don't look at my accident of birth, and I'm not proud of the fact that I popped out of a vagina in Oklahoma, right? I had nothing to do with that. I have no qualms. I have nothing again. I don't see people who live in other parts of the world as lesser than. I don't think we have any stake into being greater than. It has changed my perception. And it's also affected, forgive the long answer, it's also affected how I feel about these sort of jingoistic rituals that we do, nationalistic rituals. I pledge allegiance to the flag. We say a pledge to our flag and to the country. I've come to hate that idea because what if my country is doing something terrible? Will I be blindly allegiant to that? No. I mean, I think I need to be allegiant to the truth and
Hmm.
to goodness and morality. And yet, this sort of blind allegiance, this rote recitation that we pound into the brains of young children, saying that if you and we tell people that they're free, but if they decide they don't want to stand for the pledge, and they don't want to salute, and they don't want to stand in front of the flag and literally vow to be allegiant at all costs. If they decide they're not comfortable with that, they're treated like Judas. So you're free not to do it, but not really. There are some people who want to make the pledge mandatory. And I just find a greater utility in seeing us all, 8 billion people. We are all Africans. We are all related, not just to each other, but to all life. And I think when we see each other as relatives, it just opens up our hearts, our minds, our world, and I think our opportunities for the future.
I see. I see your accent or birth analogy, and I raise your the. I can't even take pride in my own achievements because of problems like the free will, which is I don't think exists, and things like even your IQ. I mean, things that you use on daily basis, you have no choice of. You life gives you lemon and you make lemonade. It's just as simple as that. So I can't really be proud of anything, but it keeps you humble. But let's go back to the issue of epistemology, because obviously religion has been very successful. Knowing the truth wasn't as important as being sort of tied together in a community. The rustling of the tree analogy, where you don't go and see what's behind a tree because you're afraid to be killed, and you make a type 1 error or false positive. And it was pretty wise then, because you don't have the tools of investigation to know what's causing the sound behind the trees. So you choose to believe that there is something behind the trees that's about to eat you. And we are the offspring of that, the agency, that the hyper agency detection, which was very handy. It kept us alive. We're literally offspring of these people. I don't want to say cowards, but I think pretty wise not to investigate and risk it, because for bunch of fruit or whatever you are going to collect, it's not as much as your life. But persisting to this particular era, uh, what is the higher of the two values? Staying alive, which is, I don't think it's under that much pressure anymore, or having a quality of life surrounding beliefs and information based on truth that conforms with the reality outside.
Well, if we look at the type 1 and type 2 errors of our primitive past, those were decisions made in the shadow of ignorance. We couldn't see around the corner. We didn't know what was coming. But now, I think in almost a surveillance culture,
Mhm.
we can find out anything anywhere. I mean, we can see people coming. And I think if we are honestly assessing who they are and what they want and how they think, etc., I think then we no longer have those questions about, am I should I invite in the stranger because the stranger simply wants help or to share resources, or do they want to kill me and take all my property? I mean, we still have to have a healthy awareness of what's going on, but the ignorance factor has largely gone away. We aren't sitting in the dark under trees hearing a rustle. Now I think we have a lot more that has been brought into the light. I myself, I think we cheat ourselves when we assume the worst about everybody we meet. And I think we can intuit in so many ways. I mean, we don't always get it right, and there always going to be some risk when when we leave the house and enter the world. But I think, how tragic is it? We have an entire culture of people in the States, and all they see is danger. All they see is a potential threat. Everything's coming for them. They're coming over the hill. They want to take my job. They want to steal my faith. They want to make my religion illegal. They want to confiscate my Bible. They want to take my gun. They want to make my kids trans. They want to do all these things. They're coming for me. Everybody's an other. And, I find that tragic. I think we can find out how much of this is true once we allow the emotion to subside, once we realize that there may be no reason to be afraid, and once we commit ourselves to doing our homework and not being threatened by the different. Our ignorant past, a lot of those mistakes were understandable. I think they're less understandable in the age of information.
Completely agree here. Back to a bit of Christianity, because I think we digress, but I guess that it's all sort of intertwined. There's so many areas that touches religion, but it's got elements of life outside of religion, sort of repeating itself in different ways and different forms. But we're back to Christianity, talk about Jesus, because what's a lovely man, like he's just like never errs, he's such a gentle, meek and mild, putting back that ear after being sort of cut by Peter, and fixing things around, and never done anything wrong in the 33 years he's got on earth. But that unconditional love from Jesus, for some bizarre reason, if you don't love him back, there are consequences, big ones. Why is that?
Well, I mean, the God of the Bible has always been really kind of multiple personality God. But when I hear people who are misty eyed about the Jesus that is all love and light and sunshine and happiness and Enya music, etc., I'm always reminded of that series of verses in Matthew where Jesus
Mm.
said, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. He admits and proudly says that he came to turn mothers against daughters, fathers against sons, that a man's enemies will be the member of his own household. God has always been engaged in a popularity contest where he must win at all costs, even the cost of your family. I'm trying to remember the guy in the New Testament where he's like, I want to follow you, Jesus. What do I do? And Jesus said, well, just join my group, and here we go. And he's like, well, let me go and say goodbye to my family. And Jesus
Mhm.
says, well, why do you care about them? You don't have to go. No, don't go with them. You come with me, right? It's always been a popularity contest. And so when we peel back the veneer, this sort of stained glass veneer of the Christ, we begin to see someone who is actually pretty petty. Compulsory love is just immoral. God commands us to
Mm.
love him. How does that even qualify as love? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. Well, I thought love needed to be earned. I thought love happened organically in the heart. This idea that you're going to force me to love doesn't sound like love at all. I made this analogy a few years ago. When you look at it in this way, Jesus says there is no one worthy, no, not one. So you're not worthy. You get your worth from me. You must always obey me. Don't trust in your own understanding. If you get hurt, it's your own fault. And if you leave me, I will hurt you. Well, that is a domestic partner model. That's a classic domestic abuser. And if we look at the God of the Bible honestly, we see classic domestic abuse. And I think that has to be brought to the attention of believers.
Oh, I completely agree here. Thought and love are kind of involuntary, right? If you do otherwise, you're faking it. You can't possibly. love someone by force and or force of thought. These things are involuntary. It's almost like in Pascal's wagers, like fake it till you make it type of thing. It's like, well, the key word here is faking, and you'd wonder what's the character of God, who does not care. It's almost like a social media type of God who only wants the follow, share, and likes rather than the actual essence and the quality. Has God always been like that in all the three gods that you've seen? Have you seen a God who does not care about followers, but more caring about the conduct of people?
I see that God as created in the minds of believers who don't want an authoritarian, totalitarian tyrant. You know, was it Dawkins who wrote about Yahweh as the most unpleasant character in
Mhm.
all fiction? Well, people don't want to follow that. So what they do is they say, my God is this, and that God is charity, that God is love, that God is unconditional acceptance. There's a pastor. I just love him to death, and I want to throttle him at the same time. His name is John Pavlovitz. He's a humanist pastor. He's a Christian. And he goes online to advocate for marginalized people, whether it's people of color, LGBT people, those of other nationalities, etc. And he is desperate to have a world of love and inclusion and charity and just seeing us all as the human condition. And I so appreciate that. And then he says, and the Bible supports my position. And I'm like, John, you're killing me, right? You're killing me. God never judged gay people. And I literally have to show him chapter and verse
Yes.
where gay people are put to death. You know what I'm saying? I'm just like, uh, you know, Jesus never judged anybody. And oh God, John, now I got to go show you where. And so, but I think he provides a great case study in how people fall in love with the idea of something, and then they'll mold that idea to fit. And if they're confronted with disconfirming information, they'll discard that and they'll make an adjustment to their mold. We see this with characters that people have embraced in the culture, like Mother Teresa. If I go out and I say something so scandalous as Mother Teresa was not a good person, and she wasn't,
Mm.
people flip out. How dare you? How dare you? Mother Teresa was a saint. So I say, all right, fine. Name three things about Mother Teresa that have nothing to do with the fact that she was a Catholic nun. Nobody can name anything. They don't know what charities she founded or managed. They don't know what communities that she quote unquote ministered to. They don't know anything. They don't even know which miracle supposedly qualified her for sainthood. They know nothing about
Yeah.
Mother Teresa. And yet, if you say she was not a good person, they still resist and they don't want to hear otherwise. And they've got a series of defense mechanisms. You're just wanting to malign someone, or why would you even talk about the dead in this way? The woman's long gone. Why would you bring it up? There's a series of protests. Anything other than, wow, I'm curious. Tell me more. What information do you have so I can improve my position? And we do this all the time to hero figures. We adopt them like family and we keep them in our hearts. And if something comes along that's, is supposed to make me uncomfortable about that, or they want me to reject that, no, 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 I've adopted this. I don't want to reject it. I love the idea. I did a speech, I guess 6, 7 years ago called The Mother of Bad Ideas, where we talked about how people will just fashion characters in whatever shape they want because that's what they want to believe in. And the same is true with gods.
I was going to say, with a title like that, watch out for Ben Affleck. He's going to come after it.
I'm just saying. I'm just saying. There was a guy named Chris Kyle. A film was made about him in the States by Clint Eastwood called American Sniper.
Oh,
And the
yeah.
God and Guns crowd in this country just thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. He was a hero cut down early in life. What a great American. But if you peel back the layers, you find out Chris Kyle was not a good guy. He made some very problematic claims, did some very problematic things. And yet, when I would bring that to the attention of people who were wrapped in the flag, believing he was an American hero, they weren't remotely interested in the details because they had fallen in love with the idea of Chris Kyle, the American hero. And it's hard to fight against that.
It's very true. I mean, like following up the Mother Teresa analogy, because these are personas, the archetype. Like, maybe we'll talk about Jordan Peterson in a minute, and his fear of the world is about to collapse if we lose the archetype represented in religion. But with Mother Teresa, people, you talked about the second miracle, which a lot of people don't know about. It happened remotely to confirm, because you need a second miracle to be a saint in Catholicism. But her relationship with the Duvalier family, all the money. But the most interesting part I found the whole story is her letters, the dark night of the soul, that she actually was maybe not a believer at all after all of that.
Yeah, Mother Teresa's like, I'm not even sure I believe in God. Well, that's not on the Catholic Church's brochures. They're not putting that on the websites and printing that in their official documents. And but she was a tremendously problematic person. And I don't get joy out of sounding the alarm. It's not like I have anything personal. Again, I don't have a vendetta against the Mother Teresa's. But when did it become a cheat for us to say, well, let's find out what really happened? We see this in the United States when dealing with the racism of our past and how it bleeds into the present. And if I look back, and this recently happened with Columbus Day, which is a federal holiday in the United States, and people, government workers are given the day off, and we see the God and flag crowd getting all misty-eyed over Columbus, who sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. Because that's what they learned in 3 paragraphs in school, and they learned it incorrectly. So I come forward and I say, well, actually, Christopher Columbus was a tyrant, and he introduced disease. He was involved in the international slave trade. He dismembered people. He was a sex slaver, including sex slavery for 9-year-old girls. He was a torturer. He was so bad that he was hauled back to the royal courts in Spain to stand trial for atrocities. He never once set foot in North America. Closest he got was the freaking Caribbean. People were already here. We discovered nothing, and blah, 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 right? And I just lay all this stuff out and say, well, you've got an idea of Christopher Columbus. Allow me to address the reality of Christopher Columbus. And people flipped out, and they were so mad at me. They were so mad. How dare you, you traitor? Why would you say such horrible things? And the incuriosity was interesting to watch. And the reality that they had fallen in love with this idea of who Christopher Columbus was, and they were uninterested in challenging that because they'd adopted it into their heart. And human beings, we do this all the time. And I think one of the best defenses is to be aware of it.
I think it's probably a good section to end with in the last portion of the conversation is the Jordan Peterson wants to allude to is his utter fear that the world and humanity will plummet into despair because we're going to lose the story. I'm not sure if he's religious. When he talks about Jesus, his eyes tears, but the guy is problematic. He's strange at times. But let's say he's sincere about, his concern. And you know what? He's got maybe a point in that area where you say, well, we need a story. We need a good story because we love stories as humans. And when I follow you on Facebook, you're very similar to me. I love horror movies. I love those type of movies where you escape the world and you see dragons and you see crazy stuff flying around. And I love a bit of that. We all love a bit of that, a bit of escapism. And his fear that if we don't have a solid story, and religions have worked for thousands of years to come up with very convoluted storyline that is, will compete with the best of the dramas, of human dramas. How do we replace that?
Well, I disagree with this premise. Certainly, religions have come up with remarkable stories, but I think the human story has always been more interesting. Now, certainly, we're creatures of imagination. I don't think anyone would ever deny us that we can create the fiction, the playground of the imagination. I love Lord of the Rings and the Star Wars franchise, and I enjoy all kinds of fiction. I enjoy the playground of the brain in that way. And so we can fabricate stories in that way. But we can also, I think, take real inspiration from the human stories that happen all around us every single day. I mean, right now there's a Voyager 1 spacecraft that is exiting the solar system. And right now we've seen the advent of amazing technology that's connected the world in real time. It used to take us, uh, how long to travel across the country, months and months and months, and now we can fly across it in 3 hours. Well, how's that even possible? So now we've got the story of the invention of flight, and we've seen people helping people. I mean, we've all got stories of love and laughter and overcoming challenge, setting and achieving goals, resetting and re-achieving goals. I think that stories are not exclusive to religion,
Hmm.
and I think basing those stories and rooting them in the real world actually gives them greater gravitas. It gives them more power because we're not lying to ourselves. We're not kidding ourselves. There's no ball and chain of hell and brimstone and judgment and unworthiness. Instead, we can say, well, who are we? And what a privilege it is to be alive for these finite decades. And who are we as a species? And what are we accomplishing? What does it mean to be alive in this moment? I think the stories that we tell, both true and fictional, never go away. And I totally disagree with Jordan Peterson that we need a religious model to have that type of structure and inspiration in our lives.
So, I mean, Superman, a lot of people said that's very analogous to Jesus. There's so many similarities between Superman and Jesus. You're saying we can go into the theater, enjoy 2.5 hours of Superman, and really sort of feel it, cheer for Superman against all the villains, but yet leave the theater and there will be none of the baggage of religion. There are no repercussions of not believing in Superman.
Yeah, I think there's some of that, but I think many times, and I think that Jordan Peterson's point is that a sincere belief that the Jesus story is real and grounded and true helps to imbue meaning into people's lives. They believe they're on a divine mission. They believe they will one day shuffle off this mortal coil and achieve eternal reward, and their story continues in heaven. I mean, there's a sincerity of belief that I think he's speaking to. But I think we can root ourselves in a finite life with no evidence of gods and monsters and still create human stories rooted in the real and take inspiration and structure and self generated meaning and purpose. We can still do all those things. And I think that they mean even more because they're not rooted in the primitive mythologies of our past. They're not linked to our ignorance when we saw, lightning from the sky and thought the gods were angry. Now we can better understand how the world works and why it works and what are the possibilities. And we can live knowing that if we aren't eternal creatures, every moment is even more critical because we're on the clock. Every breath we take is one day closer to the end. So we have to maximize the breaths and the heartbeats and the words and the actions and the days and our lives. And all of those things are rooted in the real, but I think they are imbued with so much more meaning because they are real.
Finally, just tackling the big cheese, the big boss, the we probably agree that the Abrahamic God or gods are very problematic. There's so many paradoxes, almost like we're talking about the married bachelor. It's not just they don't exist; they cannot exist with these attributes of all the omnis combined together, making all these conflicting issues. But let's say if there's a creator. What if there was a creator? Um, what would he or she or it do? Would it create? Would it need to create?
That's such a broad question. I don't know. I've been asked about the deistic watchmaker God. Was there an agent that spun it all into motion, and what would that God look like? Or would it even have to be a deity? Wouldn't have to be an omnipotent or even an omniscient deity. What if that deity was limited but was able to make a universe? What if we're part of a multiverse? There's a what if game that becomes interesting. But in my own mind, I'm struck by, if there was a God that was behind the singularity that set the universe in motion, and that God then is totally uninvolved in my everyday life. He just started the game and then he was done. I don't have any vested interest in that deity because that deity has no interest in me. My life, for all practical purposes, is godless. Okay, fine. Somebody spun the universe up. What else? What next? Because that God is not showing up. He's not speaking to me. He's not appearing before me. He's not a companion. He's not a friend. He's not an enemy. He's a nothing. And so, for that matter, even if there was an agent that started it all for all practical purposes, there is no God, because it is totally involved in my life. So I just operate as if none exist.
Would it be like the case of a biological father abandoning the children? Children grow up to become very, very curious. They want to know who the biological father is. They track him down. And once they track him down, say, "Oh, there you are," and they just leave because they're no longer interested. You just figured it out, and okay, and we're done here. You've done nothing for me, and I've just satisfied my curiosity of finding out who my biological father was, and that was the end of the story.
Yeah, there might be some elements that I think relate there. If you're an absentee father, who cares?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Seth, we're bang on the hour. I know you've got things to attend to. Do you want to tell the audience of any projects that you're doing? I know you're attending a couple of things that in the next few weeks. So if you want to tell the audience.
Oh, yeah. I am speaking for the Rationalist of East Tennessee. I'm going to be at the University of Tennessee on Sunday afternoon, 1 to 3. And I'm bringing a new presentation that talks about identity beliefs. And it's kind of an interesting little journey. So if anybody's welcome, if you want to go, the website for details, just go to sethandrews.com/events. This week, I'm releasing a podcast about Christian hell houses or Christian haunted houses. These are marketed during the month of Halloween, but they are designed to scare the literal hell out of people. We're doing a foray into the unpleasantness of the biblical God. That show's coming up in a few weeks. And I'm talking to Dan Barker about his new book called Contraduction, which is a word
Yes,
that he
I've
has
had them.
made up.
Yeah.
And he's going to join me in the first part of November. So lots going on. You can click on everything and find it all at thethinkingatheist.com.
I actually got Dan Barker tomorrow, so that's
Good guy.
yeah,
Good
he's
guy.
a lovely man. I love Dan Barker. Well, in the description of the video, folks, it's got all Seth's websites, the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. Please, if you are not familiar with Seth, I would urge you to listen to him, because it's such a been listening to you for years.
Thank
That calming voice, I love it. Thank you very much. You're a wonderful man.
No, it's an honor. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, folks. We'll see you tomorrow with Dan Barker.